Namaskar and welcome once again to this course on Introduction to Asset Management, which is being offered under the MOOCs initiative of the Government of India. In the last lecture today of week 2 or module 2, we will be summarizing the few examples that we have talked about, add a few examples and then close the discussion on module 2. And in this module, we have really been talking about stakeholders and the life cycle of infrastructure through illustrative examples. Moving forward, this is a regular warning to you that the material being circulated or exhibited in this course is strictly for academic and instructional purpose and should not be used for any other purpose. You are expected to use the screen as a blackboard and make a habit of making notes as usual in the old fashioned way, using what is being projected and what is being stated. We have regularly been trying to recap the previous module, which I am going to do towards the end of the lecture today. I am skipping this slide for the time being. And as far as this module is concerned, what we have talked about is basically learning about the different stakeholders, the interdependencies and so on, and the life cycle of infrastructure projects through hypothetical illustrative examples. We have tried to show how complex interdependencies and lack of foresight and funds could lead to a sad situation, though that example had been taken or created in a more private though collective domain of flat users. Then we talked about the initial denial and overall tardiness of the system that could affect an entire community because of contaminated water supply. Then we talked about flawed judgment call of a section of the railways which led to an unfortunate accident. So, moving forward, what we will do today is take a few more examples. We will talk about the lessons learned, we will move forward, summarize the module and also talk about what is going to come in the next module. As a disclaimer and a note from my side, I would like to emphasize that the learning lessons, these examples have been chosen and created from the viewpoint of development of new SOPs, modifications in existing SOPs and implementation of those SOPs, and ultimately develop a more robust system for infrastructure management with all stakeholders being partners in the process. So, the idea is not to take examples to point out fingers at one stakeholder or the other. So, now as the first example for the day, let us try to take up the situation of a brownfield construction of an elevated road or metro line in a built up area. This is a very common sight in India, and we often see the pre-construction stage where we see roads where cars or vehicular traffic moves the way it is shown here. Of course, in most places there is a lot more traffic on the road than is shown here. As a first step or stage 1 in the construction of the elevated metro or the highway, we have the construction of these central pillars. Now, at the time of construction of these central pillars, very often we barricade this part, so that the construction activities are confined to this region and the vehicular traffic does not come in this part. Then comes the stage 2, where these cantilever portions are added to the central pillars. Following that, we have the placing of precast girders, that is, these precast girders are placed on these pillars. Of course, I have not shown the girders in this part and this part and this part, so that I can still show you that the vehicular movement as far as this road is concerned still continues. Now, whether it should continue, should not continue, should be halted, diverted and so on, that remains a matter of discussion. Now, with this kind of a situation, there is a mishap that can easily happen. The traffic on the road was not stopped during the erection of the girders, and one of the girders falls during erection and crushes several cars plying below. So, what happens is that these girders, while they are being placed using cranes and so on, are in a very vulnerable position. So, one has to be very accurate, one has to be very thorough in planning how the girder is going to be lifted from the ground, maneuvered into position and lowered into position, there is a possibility, and that is what happened as far as this example is concerned, that that girder falls below and crushes some of the vehicles which are plying below. Common sense would dictate that traffic on the road should be stopped or diverted at least during the erection of the girders. Why it did not happen, or it is difficult to implement that, is simply because there are different agencies that manage the road operations and the construction work. So, the construction work is handled by a contractor who is charged with the responsibility of creating or having a safe environment for all the construction processes. Whereas the road management is generally governed by some kind of a municipal corporation or a municipal authority or a regulatory body, which is not within the control of the contractor. Very often the contractor does not even report to the municipal authorities, except that as far as the construction activities are concerned, there is a system by which the municipal authorities and the local bodies, they are aware of the construction work, they permit the construction work and are directly or indirectly responsible for all that goes on at the construction site. So, if this accident happens, this mishap happens, then of course, these people cannot say that we were not aware of the fact that the traffic had not been stopped. It is very likely that the contractor approaches the municipal authorities, please stop the traffic because it is an unsafe condition for erection of girders, and more than the erection of girders, it is the passers-by who are at risk. At times, it is difficult for the road operator to simply stop the road, because in their opinion, it would cause inconvenience to the local people and so on. Moving forward, this at the end of it is the recipe for a major mishap. So, while we saw in the railway accident in the previous example that it is within the organization that somebody makes a judgment call and says that we can possibly do things taking the law into our own hands, as they say, here is a situation where at times the contractor takes the law into his hands or her hands, trying to do an erection work or try to do a construction activity without informing the others involved, so that they can take appropriate action, or at times those people are hesitant to take the action required because they think that other people will be inconvenienced. Now, this is something which is very difficult and it is a very commonly encountered situation. What we really need to do is to understand that sensitivity and responsiveness to another fellow stakeholders' concern is an important aspect of infrastructure management. So, it is things like this that point out or help us understand, for example, the situation or the provision or the requirement to wear helmets is to protect the user, and the users must understand that even if there is an inconvenience involved, that is something that is done or that is being done for their own safety. So, in this case also, if the road has to be stopped, so be it. The users must understand that the road is being stopped because certain dangerous activities are going to be carried out at a certain point in time, and bear with it till the time the construction activities are going on. Moving forward, let us try to take another example, and that is consider a fire accident in a public place like a hotel or a mall. We often hear of a situation that there was a fire in a mall or a hotel or a club with a lot of people suffering injuries. Investigation often shows that the cause could be an electrical closed circuit, which experts later attribute to an indiscriminate increase in loads on the wiring system designed for a lower load level. Periodic physical inspection of electrical loads and wirings were neither mandated nor carried out by the regulators. What is being pointed out here is that if it is a hotel or a mall or a club, very likely the property is privately owned. That is, primarily it is the responsibility of the owners to ensure that the conditions there are safe. The wiring and so on is such that it can take all the loads. But over a period of time, it is always possible that more air conditioners are included, the load on the system increases without making appropriate changes in the wiring, which leads to a accident at some point in time. Now, in order that that does not happen, there is the regulators give permission to operate a certain facility, keeping the public interest in mind. So, the people who are using the hotel or the mall or the club, their interests are primarily supposed to be looked after by the owners of the facility, and the regulator is the person who is finally responsible to ensure that the user's well-being is taken care of. This can be done through periodic physical inspections, which in this case, as the example suggests, is not mandated and therefore not carried out by the regulators. The owners did not submit all the details to the regulators when demanding additional power connections. So, it is possible that the owners went to the regulators for approval of modifications on old drawings without providing all the details. That might have been an oversight or a willful disclosure of half the facts. Now, these are things which are very difficult to establish at a later point in time, and only highlights the fact that the owners, the regulators, everyone needs to be on board. They have to all understand their responsibility in order that there is a comprehensive, robust system of asset management in place. Some of the fire exits had been blocked by recent modifications. Now, this aspect is not a part of electrical fittings or electrical wiring, but an escape route issue, that if we block fire exits in a hotel or a mall or a club, it becomes more difficult for evacuation to be implemented, it makes it more difficult for firefighters to get in, and so on. It is not only the physical examination periodically by the electrical department, but also by the firefighting department, which needs to be highlighted and taken into account when we are talking of fire safety in these kind of public places. Now, let us go on to the third example for the day, which is considering an old bridge made of concrete in a children's park, which over time deteriorated with cracks which were clearly visible. The owners closed the access to the bridge and asked an agency to repair it. The agency filled all the cracks and repainted the bridge. Within a short time of opening the renovated bridge, the bridge gave way. Now, if these were the facts or imaginary facts, after all it is an illustrative example, there is an investigation. The investigation reveals that the reinforcement inside the concrete was badly corroded. The surface cracking which the owners saw, because of which they closed the access to the bridge, was only a manifestation of that and not the real issue. Therefore, it is clear that the owners and the repair agency did not understand the seriousness of the issue at hand. In fact, the agency was not given an appropriate scope and mandate. If the mandate is simply repair. Now, the issue is what constitutes repair. As far as this example is concerned, the way I have written it, it says the agency filled all the cracks and repainted the bridge. So, if there is a bridge or a structure or whatever it is and you see some cracks, the first thing that you will do is try to grout or fill in those cracks and repaint the structure so that it looks good to go. But unfortunately, we have not addressed the root cause of the cracks. We did not aware of it. Before we go to the agency that was not equipped to carry out the kind of work that was required, we have to identify what kind of repair work was really needed. So, the scope of work had to be probably better defined, and that is where the owners come in. The owners did not understand the seriousness of the problem, and there was a technical issue involved, that is the reinforcement in the concrete had corroded. So, the cracking was not the real issue was the corrosion, and therefore, as far as rehabilitation is concerned, the issue would have been that okay, you remove the concrete, find out how much corrosion has happened, provide additional reinforcement, do the concrete work, and then do the painting and so on. But that was neither defined nor a part of the work that was given to the agency. So, this example actually brings out the importance of having the right kind of contracts, right kind of scope, and obviously all this is related to the kind of resources that are required. This will also go to the fact that okay, how do you identify the agency for carrying out such works? An agency which is good to just fill the cracks and repaint may or may not be the best agency to carry out the kind of repair work that we just talked about, removing the concrete, providing additional reinforcement, closing with more concrete and so on. Whether any structural engineering kind of discussion or intervention is required is another story here. What this example also brings out is that at times the owner's ignorance also becomes or could become an important issue as far as infrastructure management is concerned. The last example for the day is a situation where we have an old bridge, something like this, in a place, which is replaced by this bridge at some point in time, and then by another bridge, which is this bridge at a later point in time. These two bridges are still in service and this bridge has now been abandoned. So, if we have a situation like this, which is kind of illustrated here, that we have an old bridge which is in a dilapidated condition, which was replaced by this bridge, and then finally another bridge came in here, and now all these three bridges are parallel to one another and fairly close by. Now, fairly close by means that the distance between this bridge and the distance between this bridge and this bridge, this is not very large. Now, the abandoned bridge is not monitored at all, and after a few years in a flood, one of the piers of this bridge is washed downstream and hits a pier of the newer operational bridge, causing serious damage to it. So, the description is that this bridge, which is the oldest and abandoned, was not being monitored at all, and in a flash flood one of these piers gives way and comes and hits this bridge. So, we are having a situation where we have these three bridges. This is the downstream side. So, this bridge was abandoned, a pier from here comes and hits a pier from this bridge, and this bridge gets damaged. Now, this is something which is completely unforeseen as far as the scenario is concerned. We must remember that when planning, a planner would be tempted to reduce this distance because the approach roads which were there for this bridge would need to be modified a lot more if this bridge or this bridge, whenever they were made, were far away from this bridge. The closer the new construction is to the old one, the smaller will be the amount of modification which is required from the approach roads point of view. So, with that consideration, we might like to keep these bridges closer. But what happened here was that because this bridge was not being monitored at all, what was happening to these piers was not known and the unfortunate accident happens. So, now what are the learnings? One thing is that the structures should not be simply abandoned. There should be a plan for decommissioning. We have to understand that unless we decommission the structures, the old structures which are not in use will just keep occupying space and will become an eyesore as far as the landscape is concerned. Just imagine how a city would look like 100 years from now or 200 years from now if the buildings there were not demolished and rebuilt. If we just keep adding buildings to it and alongside we have buildings which are abandoned, that will be such a mess to see, and the people at that time would think that why have we left those buildings abandoned for somebody else to just not be able to do anything about it. So, there has to be a plan for decommissioning and removing assets as they outgrow their service life. Even in the period of non-use, they should be watched. Of course, we need not have a periodic inspection and a detailed inspection and so on and so forth, but there has to be a different inspection regime for abandoned structures as well, so that any major distress and its possible implications can be watched out for. This is an important lesson from the life cycle perspective. We often talk in terms of the life cycle of infrastructure. Now, the life cycle of the infrastructure includes the decommissioning. You recall the bridge that we talked about on the Ganga, which also collapsed. Of course, in that case it was not a pier collapse, it was the collapse of one of the spans, and that span simply fell into the Ganga river. What the other technical lessons are, this is basically just common sense. There are a lot of technical issues involved, and that is something which I am leaving to you to think as far as this event or accident or mishap or disaster, whatever you call it, is concerned. With this, we come to an end of the discussion that we have as far as the illustrative examples is concerned. So, let us try to summarize as to what we have learned through these examples. I must re-emphasize that though a failure was reported in each of the narrations, that was only one example. The takeaway has only to be that that was possibly an absolutely worst case scenario. It is important to keep in mind that there is no doubt that all agencies that are engaged in managing the assets under their control do that with all sincerity and with all the resources at their disposal. Acts of omission and commission occur, and that is what we are trying to minimize through this approach, which we are trying to communicate as a comprehensive approach to the life cycle of infrastructure assets. Infrastructure is made up of innumerable structures and components, and SOPs are needed for proper documented management of these assets. No matter what asset we are talking about, each infrastructure is a complex whole of components and systems, and we need to apply a system of systems kind of a thought process as somebody in systems engineering or management would teach you. If you look at railways, for example, it is made up of the civil engineering infrastructure, which could be track, stations, bridges, tunnels. On top of that, you have a layer of mechanical equipment, whether it is locomotives or it is freight cars, and you have the electrical side, power supply, the entire data management that you have, and so on and so forth. Similarly, if you look at airports, there is the runway, there is the entire airport facility, the passengers, the aircraft maintenance, and so on. So, for an infrastructure to perform satisfactorily, it is important that each component or subsystem of that infrastructure performs satisfactorily, and that is where the system of systems kind of thought process comes in. That is where we need to have SOPs for individual structures and components, and this maintenance and management action for one side or for one type of an asset or component or subsystem cannot be done in isolation from others. This is what we have tried to communicate in all this discussion so far. So, once again, if we summarize quickly, the discussion in this module has been from the point of view of sensitizing and creating awareness towards comprehensive asset management, highlighting the involvement of multiple agencies and stakeholders in the asset management process, bringing out different dimensions of asset management, which could be technical, financial, legal, environmental, and so on, emphasizing that all stakeholders need to be more sensitive, understanding, and responsive to the requests and needs of other stakeholders. We cannot take a very narrow-minded or a parochial view of our objectives. We have to understand the overall picture a lot better. None of the stakeholders have unlimited resources, and therefore, each member of the team has to play their own bit. that will go a long way in ensuring better management of infrastructure assets. And finally, the idea has been to highlight the need to have comprehensive and inclusive standard operating procedures. As I am sure you have understood through all these examples, it is a matter of having standard operating procedures, what we can call SOPs. There are SOPs of management. There are of course existing SOPs which need to be modified. Sometimes new SOPs have to be developed with all stakeholders on board. So, that is what is the essence of this course, and I hope through these illustrative examples that has become clear to you. Now, here is only a recap from module 1. We talked about the overview in terms of administration of the course and technical content. We talked about the fact that the infrastructure is characterized by massive initial investment and has a very long service life. It could be in diverse environments and subject to damage over time due to this exposure, deterioration and performance parameters and their variations over time, and the need for having models to predict the performance, predict the deterioration, try to talk in terms of service life in that context, infrastructure management, the processes and the interventions involved in terms of inspections, repair and rehabilitation. We talked about concepts in economics and economic decision making, including the challenges in applying them in infrastructure management. Thus, the topics covered so far are assets, what the assets are, the life cycle of these assets, the stakeholders involved, performance of assets and its understanding, and the maintenance, that is maintain, keep, preserve and protect. With this, we come to a close of modules 1 and 2. I hope you have an understanding of the larger picture involved as far as asset management of infrastructure is concerned. And now, as far as the next module is concerned, which will be covered by Professor Chirag Kothari, who is a colleague of ours and offering this course together with me. We will talk about generic infrastructure management process. We will talk about the role of data in infrastructure asset management, data requirements, categories and types of data, prioritization, handling of missing data, and the role and importance of qualitative data. So, with that, I will share with you a list of references or material for further reading, which will help you understand the subject matter covered today and being covered in this entire course. So, with that, we come to an end of our discussion today, and like always, I express my thanks and indebtedness to my teachers, colleagues and students who have helped me understand this whole subject of infrastructure management better. Thank you.